It was a hot summer afternoon when police officer Mark Santos found himself facing another protest. The city was rife with social tensions, and the crowd, made up mostly of young black men, marched with signs demanding justice. The outcry was loud, but for Mark, with more than 15 years of police experience, it was just another day on the job. He was used to riots, with demonstrations that often ended in confrontation. But something about that afternoon felt different. He stood next to other police officers watching from afar. It was an organized movement, mostly peaceful, but there was a growing unrest in the air. Mark clenched his fists, feeling the heat of confrontation approaching. He knew the orders were clear: maintain order, make sure the demonstrations didn't turn violent. But he had already made up his mind. When his eyes fell on a group of young people, he felt uneasy. They stood on the sidelines, watching everything with defiant eyes, as if they were waiting for something. Mark, from experience, knew that young people like this were not always peaceful. His instincts told him something was wrong. Without hesitation, he approached them, his footsteps echoing down the dusty street. "What are you doing here?" His voice was firm, but not friendly. The young men, however, did not back down. One of them, a young man in his 20s, looked him straight in the eye, unafraid. "We are just protesting, sir," he replied calmly, but his posture was defiant. Marcos did not like this. He had the power. He was the police. The sense of control was almost palpable. Without giving him time to respond, Mark advanced, pushing the young man against the wall. He knew he had the right to search him, to make sure there was no threat. But the way he did it, with excessive authority, immediately made the young man react. In one quick movement, the boy pushed Mark, trying to free himself. That was the trigger. Rage took over Mark, and in a fit of rage, he pulled out his gun and fired. The sound of the gunshot pierced the hot afternoon air, causing everyone around him to freeze for a moment. The young man fell to the ground, screaming in pain, while blood began to spread across the asphalt. The scene caused immediate panic, and the crowd fled in despair, some people screaming, others filming. Mark froze for a moment, staring at the young man who was now on the ground, his eyes almost closed, in a state of compromised consciousness. He didn't want to do this, but something inside him made him act, without thinking about the consequences. It was as if the weight of his authority had blinded him, and now he was faced with a tragedy. The ambulance arrived quickly, but time seemed to pass. The young man was rushed to the hospital, and Mark was taken away from the scene with the gun still warm in his hands. Embarrassment was already starting to take hold of him, but he had no idea the impact it would have. The scene at the hospital was chaotic. Doctors and nurses scurried back and forth as the young man, now in a coma, was rushed into the operating room. His injuries were serious. He had been shot in the abdomen and had suffered significant blood loss. The nurses' faces were grim, and the sound of the monitors filled the room with a strained melody. The young man's family was not there. They had not yet been notified, but the emptiness in the air was a foretaste of the suffering to come. The city, however, fought back. The news showed footage of the shooting on a loop. The victim, a young black man, quickly became a symbol of a much larger problem: systemic racism and police brutality. The civil rights movement gained momentum in the streets, with protests demanding justice for the young man who had been attacked. His name was not yet widely known, but the collective outrage was palpable. At the hospital, the situation became more complicated. The young man, whose name was Carlos Oliveira, underwent surgery, but his condition remained serious. He remained unconscious, immersed in an internal struggle for his life. When his parents arrived at the hospital, they were surprised to see their son lying in bed, immobilized and unconscious. The pain was visible in his eyes, but amidst the anguish, there was also a silent determination. Meanwhile, Mark, the police officer who shot Carlos, found himself spiraling into guilt and shame. What had started out as a simple approach, a situation he felt was necessary to maintain order, had now turned into a nightmare. The weight of his actions began to consume him. He had shot the young man and he was in a coma. The question that echoed in his mind was, how did he get there? An internal investigation was launched immediately, and statements about the incident soon began to emerge. The pressure on Mark grew with each passing day. His colleagues, who had once been his friends, began to distance themselves. Many said that he had overreacted, that his reaction was disproportionate, but there were also those who tried to justify Mark's behavior by claiming that he had been afraid. However, the hardest part was dealing with the protests that took to the streets. The images of Carlos lying on the ground, surrounded by a terrified crowd, never left Mark's mind. He tried to concentrate, but guilt tormented him. What did I do? This question echoed over and over again, but he could not find an answer that would relieve him. The city was in crisis, and he was one of those responsible for this crisis. And in the meantime, Carlos remained in a coma, his life depending on the skills of the doctors and something beyond science. That night, Mark could barely sleep. Carlos's face, pale and still, appeared in his dreams. He woke up early the next day, the weight of the decision weighing even more heavily on his shoulders. He knew he would have to face the consequences of his actions, but he had no idea that those consequences would be so devastating. The silence of the morning was overwhelming, and he didn't know how to redeem himself. The sound of his own breathing was all Mark could hear as he stood in front of the hospital door, just before entering the room where Carlos was being treated. His mind was chaotic, his thoughts racing. He felt the weight of guilt crushing him, but there was also a growing sense of panic. Mark knew he had to do something, that he had to justify himself. But what could he say? How could he explain that in a fit of rage and fear, he had nearly destroyed a life? As he walked down the hospital corridor, people's gazes seemed to weigh heavily on him. Some seemed to recognize him, but avoided contact. Others were more attentive, as if they were waiting for an explanation that he did not have. When he finally entered the room where Carlos was, his mother, Doña Maria, was sitting next to her son's bed. Her eyes were red and swollen, anguish written all over her face. Mark hesitated for a moment, the lump in his throat preventing him from speaking. He knew that nothing he could say would ease the mother's pain, but he felt an urgent need to apologize. I tried to save your son, he thought. I tried to do the right thing. But something in her eyes, that motherly look of deep, uncompromising pain, made him feel even smaller. There were no words for this kind of pain. It was then that the door opened again, and an imposing figure entered. It was Detective Paulo Lima, who was in charge of investigating the case. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine at the sight. Paulo didn't seem to be there just as an investigator, but as someone with a mission to discover the truth behind the shooting. He looked at Mark with an impassive expression without saying a word. "How is he?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. "He's stable, but his condition is still serious," the detective replied formally, although his expression revealed something else. Mark tried to look at Carlos's mother, but she looked away as if the officer wasn't welcome. The tension was palpable, and Mark felt a sense of isolation. "I didn't know where I fit in anymore." It was at that moment that Detective Paulo did something unexpected. He approached Mark and, without further explanation, handed him a card. "This is Carlos's father's ID card," he said calmly. Mark looked at the paper without understanding what the detective meant. He was a war veteran, a respected man. And for some reason, Mark, you have something in common with him. Mark looked at Paulo, confused, not understanding the connection. What? What does he have to do with this? Paulo looked at him with an enigmatic smile. Carlos is the son of one of yours. He paused, as if the words wanted to sink into Mark's mind. That war veteran is your father, Mark. The words fell like a weight on Mark's shoulders. He stepped back, taking an involuntary step. It couldn't be true. His father, A black veteran Mark had never known existed? The revelation surprised him, but something even heavier settled on his chest. The weight of guilt now multiplied, and the feeling that his very identity was being called to account. Detective Paulo, sensing Mark's surprise, calmly added, "Now you must understand the gravity of all this. It's not just about the violence of your act, but what it represents. You have to prepare yourself for what's coming." Mark could no longer process everything that was happening. The connection between him and Carlos, though remote and impossible, now haunted him. And deep down he knew that this discovery would change the course of his life forever. The panic he felt mixed with a devastating confusion, and the only thought that dominated his mind was the same. What do I do now? Mark froze. He stared at the file in his hands, trying to process the words he had just heard. Detective Paulo spoke with a coldness that didn't seem to match the magnitude of the situation. "Carlos is your brother," he said. But that seemed impossible. How could he have a brother? Especially a black brother without even knowing it. Mark felt a whirlwind of emotions invade his chest. Surprise, anger, guilt, and most of all, an anguished emptiness. Doña Maria, still at Carlos's bedside, seemed to sense that something was wrong. She looked at Mark suspiciously. The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence that followed the revelation was almost unbearable. Paulo, sensing everyone's discomfort, tried to ease the situation. "Let's take a break, Mr. Mark," he said, his voice softer. "I need you to think about what you just heard. The connection you have with Carlos is much deeper than you think." Mark felt a weight growing on his shoulders, as if his very identity was being rewritten before his eyes. He had never known about his father, a black veteran who he now discovered was a central figure in his life. The fact that his father was someone so distant and yet so close to his current reality left him reeling. He left the room with the form in his hand, not knowing where to go. He walked through the hospital corridors aimlessly. People's faces seemed blurry, as if they were in a dream. He felt the pressure of guilt intensify even more, now with the revelation that the young man in a coma was not just a victim of his thoughtless action. Carlos, now that he knew it was his brother, complicated the situation even more. It was an emotional weight that Mark did not know how to carry. He no longer knew who it was. The police officer, the man in white who swore to protect order, or the brother who acted against his own family without even knowing it. Mark stood in front of a hospital window. Outside, the sky was overcast, as if reflecting the storm inside. He thought about all his options, his police training, his law enforcement classes, his talk of self-defense. But what he had done was not self-defense. It was nothing like that. It was an unjustified attack. He had hurt a man, and that man was now his brother. And the reality that this was beyond any police policy, beyond any training, hit him hard. In the distance, he heard the siren of an ambulance, and the sound reminded him that he was still on duty, that his role as a police officer would not disappear with the revelation of his identity. But at the same time, everything he thought he had learned seemed to crumble. He could no longer see the division between the justice he defended and the pain he had caused his own blood. Mark returned to Carlos's office, but he was no longer the same man. He looked at Doña Maria, who was still there, her eyes fixed on her son, and then at Carlos, who seemed even more fragile now that the truth was before Mark, like a silent condemnation. He wanted to apologize, but he knew there were no words for it. Nothing could erase what he had done. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. Doña Maria looked at him. She didn't say anything, but the pained look she gave him made Mark feel the weight of a lifetime of regrets. Detective Paulo re-entered the room. His eyes were fixed on Mark, as if he were watching him carefully. "Are you ready to face the truth, Mark?" Mark didn't answer. He knew that nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen, but the answer was already clear in his mind. There was no way out of it anymore. He would have to deal with the consequences of his actions. The days following his confrontation with the truth were a whirlwind of uncertainty for Mark. He tried in vain to organize his thoughts as he prepared himself for the wave of consequences that would surely come. Flashes of memories about the attack on Carlos, the terrified eyes of his fallen brother, and the sound of his own hurried footsteps as he fled the scene haunted him relentlessly. The truth was engraved in his mind. He had acted impulsively, without thinking about the repercussions of his actions, without considering that this man, his brother, was more than just a victim of a police operation gone wrong. That cold morning, Mark sat alone in his apartment, looking at Carlos's file and the photo of his father, which he had found in one of the few family keepsakes his mother still had. The image of a black man with a firm face and serene eyes, with an expression that Mark never imagined associating with his own father, stared back at him. How could this happen? Mark asked himself, his mind racing. The pain was like a sharp blade cutting through his heart, and doubt consumed him. The father-son relationship he never knew existed was now before him, like a broken mirror that he could not put back together. He knew that, no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, there was something bigger at play. The system, the power structures, the prejudices, and the family relationships were forces that were now intertwined in a complex way that was impossible to ignore. Mark knew that Carlos was not just a victim of police violence. He was the embodiment of a broken system, of a cycle of oppression that Mark now saw more clearly and more frighteningly. Everything he had been taught about justice seemed to have been a convenient lie. There was no going back, no untying the knots of the past. The next morning, Mark received a call from Detective Paulo. "We have news," he said seriously. "We need to talk, Mark." The meeting was held in a windowless room in the police department. The smell of bitter coffee and the sound of tearing papers filled the silent room. Paulo sat across from Mark, taking his time to speak, as if waiting for Mark to make the first move. The words hung heavy in the air. "You understand the gravity of the situation, right?" Paulo said bluntly. Mark knew the conversation wouldn't be easy. "What happened to Carlos and what you did will have a much bigger impact than you imagined." Mark hung his head, feeling the weight of what he already knew. "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to go back." Detective Paulo watched him carefully. "The system will react. You can try to hide, but you won't succeed. The only thing you can do now is be honest. Face what happened and who you really are, and most importantly, face the consequences of your own behavior." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He knew there was no escape. The truth would come out, and whether it was a cop or a brother, the consequences would be merciless. The dilemma was enormous. If he turned himself in to justice, it would be the end of his career, and perhaps even his freedom. But I also knew that I could not live with the feeling that something so huge had been done in the name of order without being confronted. Paulo, with a deep sigh, continued, "You are not alone in this. There are people who believe in you, but you will have to show that you are willing to change." Marcos didn't respond. He didn't know how to change or what he could do, but his conversation with the detective left him with a sense of urgency. He needed to act, but his mind was overwhelmed. All he wanted was to find a path to redemption, but the future seemed further and further away. Meanwhile, Carlos remained in a coma. His brother's health was unstable, and the doctors were trying to contain the consequences of the attack. Mark felt the anguish of not being able to repair the damage he had caused, but what consumed him most was the doubt about the future. How could he redeem himself in front of his own family? How could he be the brother Carlos deserved when Mark himself no longer understood himself? The only thing that seemed certain at that moment was that the story of his life had just taken a turn he could never have foreseen, and he would soon realize that the price for it would be immeasurable. The following days dragged on, Heavy and dense, each one seemed like a reflection of the other, a constant repetition of anguish and uncertainty. Mark didn't know what to do or where to start. His job in the police seemed like a distant life, something he could no longer connect with. He found himself obsessed with a single thought. What would he do now? What could he do to correct such a huge mistake, such an irreversible defect? He couldn't go back in time, but he urgently needed to understand how to move forward. On the morning of the 6th day after the revelation, Mark received a new call from Detective Paulo. "Mark, you need to be here. We need to talk about how we are going to conduct the investigation. Carlos's case is being treated as a serious incident. The media is starting to cover the story, and you know what that means." Mark felt a weight fall on him. The pressure of everything happening outside his control was becoming suffocating. Detective Paulo was right. The media, with its tendency to magnify the mistakes of police officers, was simply waiting for the right moment to turn the situation into a national scandal. It was no longer just Mark the cop. Now he was the face of a broken system, a representation of everything that was wrong with the police, and his connection to Carlos, his brother, was now part of a larger and more complex plot than he could comprehend. When he arrived at the police station, he found Paulo in a room full of papers and documents. The detective was more serious than ever. "Carlos's case is not just yours, Mark," he said bluntly. "What happened was a reflection of something much bigger. It has to do with institutional racism, abuse of power, and a series of problems within the police force itself. This has been going on for a long time." Mark looked at him, unsure of how to react. "So what do I do? How do I solve all this?" Paulo sighed and leaned back in his chair. "What you need to do now is face the consequences, Mark. That means cooperating with the investigation, being honest about what happened, and doing whatever it takes to right the wrongs. At the same time, you have to start thinking about the future. Carlos is in a coma, and we don't know what will happen to him. This will change his life forever. But what you do from now on could be the key to his redemption." Mark felt a lump in his throat. "I never thought this was possible," he muttered, more to himself than to Paulo. "I never imagined that one day I would hurt someone like this, especially my brother." The detective, now calmer, observed him carefully. "I understand what you're going through, Mark. No one expects to be tested like this. But you have a chance to do the right thing. The first step is to take responsibility, not just for what you did, Carlos, but for everything you did. That represents your action. What you did was wrong, and the only way to make it right is to face reality." Mark, as painful as it was, knew that Paul was right. He couldn't change the past, but he could somehow shape the future. When Mark left the police department, he felt like a man torn between two worlds. On the one hand, he still felt the weight of the police identity that had followed him for years. On the other hand, there was the pain of revelation, the truth that he was not only an officer of the law, but also part of a much more complex family history. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that he could no longer run away from who he really was. In the hospital, Carlos's condition was still critical, and Mark felt an emptiness that no words could fill. He approached his brother's bed, still in a coma, hoping that perhaps one day Carlos would hear his words. "I don't know what to do, Carlos," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix all this, but please give me a chance to try." Mark put his hand in Carlos's, and for a moment, everything around him disappeared. The internal struggle he was waging, the pressure of the system around him, the fear of the future, everything became distant. There, in the stillness of that hospital room, he found something rare, a moment of peace. He didn't know what would happen, but in that moment he was ready to face the consequences, not only of what he had done, but of what he could still become. Time seemed to have no meaning for Mark anymore. The days were a series of moments that quickly disappeared as he tried to find a way to deal with the consequences of what he had done. The pressure on him grew with each passing hour. The media began to report the first reports of Carlos's incident, and rumors about his identity as the officer's brother grew stronger. Each new day brought a new level of public scrutiny, and Mark knew there was no way to escape it all. He found himself faced with a moral dilemma. What was more important, loyalty to his profession or responsibility to his brother and the truth? The answer seemed simple, but it was actually one of the hardest decisions I have ever faced. At any moment, a more aggressive approach from the media could take control of the narrative. He needed to do something now, before things got even more out of hand. It was then that Detective Paolo called again, his voice deep and direct. "Mark, we need to talk. Carlos's case is taking a turn that you cannot ignore. The evidence against you is piling up, and the police chief is pushing for your suspension. We cannot allow him to be removed now. We need to act quickly." Mark took a deep breath, and the tension in his shoulders increased. "What do you suggest, Paolo?" "You have to cooperate. The only way now is to open your mouth, take responsibility, and cooperate with the investigation. This will not erase what happened, but it can reduce the sentence. You have to do this for yourself, for Carlos, and for your own conscience." Mark was torn, but he knew Paul was right. If he truly wanted a chance at redemption, the only option was the truth, even if it was painful. "I will do whatever it takes," he said firmly, and the decision finally took shape. In the days that followed, Mark sought out the family's defense attorney, a woman named Lara who had experience with cases like his. She welcomed him into her office, a simple but cozy space. Lara was not your typical hard, cold, calculating attorney. She was empathetic, but she knew she couldn't ease Mark's pain. What she had to do was prepare him for the worst. "You know that if you cooperate, the consequences can be serious, right?" Lara asked bluntly. "But it's your only chance to reduce your sentences, Mark. The fact that you're a cop and you acted like this changes everything. The media, public opinion, everything is against you now." Mark nodded, feeling a growing weight on his shoulders. "I know. But what can I do? I can't live with this anymore. I have to do the right thing." Lara watched him closely. "If you are truly willing to take responsibility, the first step is to tell the truth. And don't forget that your collaboration may affect other people's futures. The police system as you know it, with its flaws and corruption, needs to be held accountable too." Mark felt the impact of Lara's words. He was fighting not only against his own mistakes, but also against the system he had long believed to be fair. The moral dilemma became increasingly complex. That night, he couldn't sleep. Images of Carlos, still in a coma, haunted him, along with the certainty that he had somehow contributed to the creation of a cycle of violence that could never be broken. He knew there was no way to correct the mistakes of the past, but perhaps he could at least try to prevent them from happening again. The next morning, as he walked through the city streets, Mark felt a strange sense of disorientation. Each step seemed to echo in his mind as a reminder of everything he had lost. He knew there was no going back. What awaited him was an uncertain future, but he also knew that, as painful as it was, this was the only possible path to redemption. When she arrived at the hospital to visit Carlos once more, the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. His brother was paler, but he was still alive, stuck in a limbo between life and death. Mark sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, trying to silently apologize. There were no words that could ease his guilt, but he felt that somehow there was still a chance to repair some of the damage he had caused. "I'll do it right, Carlos," she whispered. "I'll try." Mark knew the future was still at stake. The battle was just beginning, and he knew the consequences of his actions would come hard. But for the first time in a long time, he felt willing to face whatever it took to try to redeem himself, for Carlos and for all the others who had been victims of the system he was now beginning to question.